So it is the end of my 2-week quilt top challenge. I have finished all of my quilt tops. Spoiler alert. So exciting. But I wanted to walk you through last week. I didn't post any YouTube videos last week because I ended up getting sick and had family in town for the whole week. Was sick for maybe about half of the week. So I shared recaps here and there on Instagram as I could. And then as I started to feel better, I was able to do more. This was my first quilt of last week. As I was starting to feel better, I did a little bit each day. And my first time doing ruler work, which was a lot of fun actually. So this is a star petals quilt. It's my own pattern. It's a mini quilt pattern. And so that means it's a one block pattern. But in a lot of my one block patterns, I'm pretty sure this one, but I can't remember exactly, have fabric requirements for a whole quilt. I'm not sure if this one does. But regardless, I made a 16 block star petals quilt with a lot of fun, bright, happy fabrics. And I wanted to quilt it really special. So I started with a free motion heart in the middle of the kind of circle in the middle of the star. And then I went out and I stitched in the ditch for the star, just around the star. And then at the end of this little clip, you'll see me do loops around the petals. So I'm showing this to you at live, like actual time, like speed, so that you can see how slow I was when I was first beginning. I have gotten quicker. Ruler work to me is definitely like just patience. And I do think I need to invest in, it's like a ruler platform for your long arm. So it just makes the base of the long arm bigger so that as it's moving around with a wider ruler, I can have something for that ruler to press against. Because I did find it sometimes the ruler would wobble a bit because there's only like a 3 to 4 inch platform underneath the quilt there of the sewing machine base. So after I did the heart and then the star stitch in the ditch, you can see these loops going around. That was a lot of fun. And then I don't actually have a clip of this, but after I did a row of the flowers, what I just explained there, I went back and I did the background of that row, and I did basically like a circles border around each flower on each block. And it's not perfect, but there's not a lot of background in this quilt, so it definitely worked out okay, and I think it looks pretty good. This is the full quilt done. I really love it. It's big too. These blocks are 18 inches. Ruler work was scary to me, but I would highly recommend if you have a long arm to test it out. It can really make a difference. And I use it in a later quilt at the end of my challenge as well. So pretty excited about the Star Petals quilt. Then throughout the week, I worked on this hand quilted quilt. I started pulling it out at the beginning of the week while I was sick and was not enjoying just sitting watching shows. So it was probably about 25 to 35% done. And spoiler alert, I did finish it this week. I worked on it a little bit while I was sick, and then a little bit more as I was starting to feel better, and then in the evenings as well when my family was here. And I finished it on Friday night, so that's really exciting. What I'm doing here, I thought I would share, is marking a line on the quilt to quilt on top of. So this is a Hera marker. It doesn't actually make like a mark like a pin or a marker. It makes kind of an embossed line when you run it along the edge of a ruler and kind of push down. You kind of saw that at the beginning of this quilt in this video. And I'm doing 2-inch cross hatching on this quilt. So right now I'm just doing the last lines 2 inches apart. I'll do 3 to 4 at a time and then quilt those and do 3 to 4 more just in case I don't get around to quilting everything that I mark. I do mark less so that those marks don't dissipate on their own before I can get to them, which happens sometimes. So it's a good thing to try if you're new to hand quilting. This is a bonus quilt that my mom brought. She made this quilt using my Do You Want to Sew a Snowman pattern. She made one snowman black, and then she ended up doing a bunch of different borders around it, patchwork, solid borders, HSTs, to make it a throw size quilt. And we put it on my long arm, so that was exciting. I was feeling a lot better this day, and I did a lot of the quilting on it. I did pebble quilting within the snowman itself and a handwritten Let It Snow across the bottom of the snowman. We outlined the scarf so she could hand quilt it. And in the background, we did like big kind of loopy, flowy lines. And she did do a few of the background lines. I just don't think she really wanted to do a lot because she didn't want to mess it up. And then my sister was here too, and she's not a sewer, crafty, with textiles, although she does a lot of scrapbooking, but she did a line of quilting too, so that was really fun and awesome to get to quilt that for my mom and throw a bonus quilt onto my pile this week, so it's pretty fun. Okay, once I was fully back to normal, this week is when I started actually quilting again. I would say probably by Tuesday evening. I was feeling well enough to do a lot of quilting. And the Starbeam quilt was the one I put on after my Star Petals quilt and after my mom's quilt. So I think third of the week. And I just did big loopy quiltings. Part of kind of getting behind with being sick is I kind of was like, I need to just do some simple loopy, my classic go-to pattern now, instead of doing a lot of this fun custom work, which is awesome. And I'm glad I took the time to do that when I did. But doing some of the loopy quilting, which I love anyway, worked well for me. I did use connecting threads, and so far I do like connecting threads towards the top. Today I'm going to do a quilt with a glide and see if that is still as nice as it was prior to this machine. That is the main reason for my thread choices, or testing, I guess, is because glide has been splitting and breaking a lot on my new machine, but since I've fixed all the tensiony issues, fingers crossed, it might be great. I quilted the Star Petals quilt with Superior Threads Omni thread, and wasn't my favorite. It did a great job quilting. I feel like the back had a tiny bit of tension issues here and there. I did not have any major breakage within the quilting, but whenever I was doing the long basting stitch with that Omni thread across the top of a quilt, it would skip stitches or break, which this one was the Omni to baste on, and then I switched over to the Connecting Threads Essential Pro. So Omni is currently on my lower list of likes for thread. Like I said, I'm going to try glide next. I'm doing the next quilt to go on is this one, a Trip Around the World quilt. And then I'm going to do one with finesse again because I liked finesse. It is linty. Those are all my threads over there. But the finesse, the connecting threads, the glide, fingers crossed, all seem to be working really great. So I'm trying to just determine if I have a favorite. But I think the Omni has dropped off my list of ones that I'm not super fond of. It also just, oddly enough, it feels the thinnest, but feels like the bobbins run out the quickest. And I know that changes based on your quilting, like how dense it is, but still, it did seem to run out very quickly, even though it felt the thinnest, which is odd. So I have done 9 quilts so far, 6 from last week. 1, 7, 8, 2. Sorry, odd counting there. And then I did 1 for my mom that she brought too, so I'm counting that. Okay, so after the Starbeam, I did my trip around the world quilt, and this one took a bit of time, but it's very simple and mindless. I just did loops, but I did them a little bit tighter so that I could put a loop in the middle of each square. And I did 1 loop up and then 1 loop down, and 1 loop up and then 1 loop down. So it was nested. And it was great. So then I just thought I would share the finished hand quilted quilt. And you can see the kind of the cross hatching there in the blue section really well. I use templates I got from Jen, who I believe is Betty Crocker Ass on Instagram, and I believe they're called Make It Curvy templates now, and I just kind of made this quilt up with her templates. So next I did the New Star beginner quilt pattern. This is actually one of the versions of the quilt that you can make if you buy this pattern and then use my free course that's based here on YouTube and my blog. It's a very simple, beginner-friendly pattern written specifically for beginners, so I highly recommend it if you're new to quilting. Okay, so I am on my last quilt top, and I have been trying these little strawberries free motion quilting, and I kind of got like, what am I doing? They're so wonky and weird. So I did a poll on Instagram, and it was close, but over 60% now say I should keep going. Unfortunately, I noticed as I was traveling across the top to get to this side that my machine was skipping stitches, and then I peeked at the back and there's a bunch of loose, weird stitching on the back, so I'm gonna have to pick it all out anyway. So that's unfortunate, and I don't really know what's going on with my machine. Maybe it has had too much quilting happening over the last 2 weeks. So I've got to do some more tests on a quilt sandwich and unpick all of this. So that's kind of sad. Some of them are cute, but I don't think it's quite the right vibe looking at it more, since I actually have to pick it out. So the back will hopefully have good tension. I'm gonna do something different, I think. So there's that. Okay, my machine, I feel like maybe I should name it. I don't really do that, but also we've spent a lot of time together recently. I had a heck of a time. Realized that all the strawberries, I think I said that earlier, the tension was wrong. Spent a solid hour or so rethreading, cleaning, oiling, changing needles, and finally got everything good to go. I put my needle in backwards. That was one of my issues. I think I did need some oil, and just everything tweaked a little bit. So we're back in business. I am doing like loopies on an angle in the background, and then I'm going to do some quilting on the starfy part, and I think I'm going to leave the sashing plain, so each quadrant will be done separately. And I'm going to finish it tonight because it's the last day of my 2-week challenge, and I am determined. So here I go. Okay, while I'm quilting up this quilt, I thought I would talk a little bit about all the things I tried this week. So I have mentioned definitely on Instagram, I can't remember if in the videos from last week that on one of the first quilts, the first squirrel quilt, I used Hobbs cotton batting. I had bought a package last minute when I had ordered threads because I wasn't sure if my batting roll was going to get here in time. And so I use that on my squirrel quilt. I don't love it. It's super, super thin. I use Warm and Natural from, or Warm and Plush from the Warm Company, which is 50% thicker than Warm and Natural, which is, they're both 100% cotton batting. And the Hobbs cotton batting, I'd say, was probably about 2/3 the thickness of Warm and Natural. And I like the plusher version. So I think if you live in a warmer climate, the Hobbs cotton batting would work. But I also noticed when I had to like stretch it or smooth out bumps in while I was quilting, like prepping the next section of the quilt to quilt, that it very easily got holes in it. So I wouldn't really recommend it. I have used other Hobbs batting and had luck. I believe I've used like their 80/20, and then I've used, I think, their wool batting and have enjoyed it. But this one, just for some reason, the cotton batting does not compare to the Warm Company, which is my preference. If you don't like the super thick plush quilts, like you can really see in this quilt how plush it is because you can see the definition in those puffy loops, then just try their regular Warm and Natural or Warm and White. And I think if you have never used it before and you like cotton batting, you would be happy with it. It's a really great product. I did a lot of Franken batting for a bunch of my quilts this week, which just means I took bigger scraps and zigzag stitched them together. From last week's YouTube video, you saw me do that. I ended up not doing that curvy version that I shared in the video last week because I struggled with that one, having it line up properly. I know that when you have a quilt on the long arm, if your batting runs out, cutting that curve is best. But I realized for me, when I'm making the Franken batting before I'm putting it on the long arm, I want that straight edge. So I get a 90-inch wide roll of batting, and typically I use that for the height of my quilt. So most of my quilts are around 72 inches tall, so I get a solid 18 inches left over, and I just sewed together a bunch of those strips to make sizes or heights that I needed for some of my smaller quilts. So I did that for 2 or 3 quilts, which was great to get some of that used up. I do save much smaller pieces of batting for if I need to put them in bags or anything, and for smaller mini quilts or pillows and stuff like that. But if it's one of those bigger strips that's like 18 to 24 inches by probably about 60 to 66 inches wide, I am able to put those together to make batting for a larger quilt. One of the other things that I was doing this week was testing threads. I tested glide thread, which I've used up until now exclusively, pretty much. I used it on my old machine. It was great. I was recommended it by some friends. This machine, for some reason, it just doesn't love glide. And I'll talk about that in a second a little bit more. But the other ones I used were the Grace Company's Finesse thread. They sent me a big cone of their white and a bunch of colors since I'm an ambassador. And then I used Superior Threads Omni and Connecting Threads Essential Pro. So the two that I liked the least were the Omni by Superior Threads. That's probably my least favorite. And I'll tell you why. I had the most trouble with that thread. Even after I did a whole quilt sandwich to test all the threads out, to figure out tension for everything, and it was fine on that. When I went to quilt a quilt, I just had issues with it. It broke a few more times than any of my other ones did. I don't think I really had any breakage this time after I figured out the tension issues. And I noticed that when I would do the long straight stitches to base the batting and the quilt top to the backing, that I would get skip stitches or it would break with that thread. And it's thinner. I did say in this video earlier, it was definitely felt the thinnest, but it felt like the bobbins ran out faster. So I don't know how that works out. And I know it varies based on how dense your quilting is, but it just wasn't my favorite. So I would still use it if needed. And I have a whole cone of it, so I will definitely use that up. The next that in line would be glide. So I did get tension better. That was one of my issues with this machine, which, because I didn't mention this video before, but you probably know from my other videos, I am quilting on a Grace Company Qnique 21X Elite and their Quilters Evolution 8-foot frame. I'm an ambassador for Grace. I love this machine. I've had a Grace machine now for almost 5 years. So, and this, I've only been an ambassador for about 6 months. But so the glide thread worked great on my Qnique 15R, which was my old machine, a much smaller machine, and they don't even make that machine anymore. They've kind of upgraded to the 16 is their base machine. But with this machine, for some reason, the thread broke a lot. It kept splitting, and it is the only thread out of these 4 that is not matte. It is shiny and slick looking, where all the other threads, even though all of them are polyester, the other 3 threads, Omni, Essential Pro, and Finesse, all look like cotton thread, which I think is very interesting. So I did figure out those tension issues, so I wasn't having any more breakage, but it still seems to twist a lot and unravel. And it quilted up on the quilts I did just fine, but I don't love the look of a shiny thread, so that is why it ends up being 3rd on my list of 4. So not all the way at the bottom, because it did fine after I got the tension issues figured out. So next, I really don't have a favorite between the last 2, Connecting Threads Essential Pro and Finesse from Grace Company. I would say the only reason maybe Finesse might eke out Connecting Threads is because Finesse is thicker, and I tend to like a thicker looking thread on my quilts. I just like that look. I love hand quilting. I like to see a chunky thread, and Connecting Threads Essential Pro is definitely thinner. I probably had the least problems with that one, though. Once I got for Finesse the tension stuff worked out, it worked beautifully. It is more linty, I'll have to say that, for Finesse. And oddly enough, and I wonder if it has something to do with my bobbin, I'm going to try again. I had prepped a quilt to use the blue color of Finesse thread, and it hated it. And so I abandoned, went back to a different thread. Then I worked out all the tension issues. I used a variegated thread from Finesse and on another quilt, and it worked beautifully. The Finesse white thread worked beautifully. And then I was like, oh, I've got these 3 bobbins of the blue thread. Let's go back to the blue thread and use that for a different quilt this week. Nope, hated it again. And I'm like, what is with this blue thread? My poor long arm just does not like the color blue, I guess. So I'm not sure when I was first winding the bobbins for Finesse, because it is thicker, it was winding them very loose. So I don't know if that had something to do with it, and I'll play around with it a little bit more and update you guys, I'm sure, in a later video, so of how all that went. But I would say Connecting Threads is a really great thread. It is thinner and less linty than Finesse, which I ended up really liking Finesse as well, just not the blue one. But the variegated one worked great, and I didn't try any of the other colors. Colored thread is not what I typically go towards, so I'll have to set time aside and really work with some of the other colored threads to see if it was just a bobbin issue or whatever. But the Finesse thread I ended up also really liking. Like I said, it's thicker, which is something I like, but it is lintier. So, you could kind of take each of those with a grain of salt. That's kind of personal preference. I think something to really stress in this situation is tension. When I was having tension issues with the glide, and then when I started switching to these threads, because they're all kind of different thicknesses, at least they look like it. I didn't actually read what thickness they were because in my mind, I didn't really think about quilting threads having a thickness, but I'm sure they do. But with tension issues, everything that I was reading in the Grace Manual, I was looking up online, going to outside YouTube videos that were people were making, was saying to, if you have your top thread coming towards your back too much, so you see loops of your top thread on your back, that means your tension is too low and you should ratchet your tension up higher. And so I was doing that and it wasn't working, it wasn't helping, it wasn't doing anything. Finally, I revisited Leah Day. She has amazing videos. I highly recommend her. I'm pretty sure she was a Grace ambassador. She works with Qniques a lot and has so many wonderful videos. And I watched a bunch when I first got my long arm, but I haven't watched any in a while. And I was, Googling away, like tension issues, Qnique. And so I watched one of hers and she kind of said, and I was like, oh, light bulb, go back to zero, put your tension all the way down to zero and, rethread everything. Like she's like step by step. And so when I went back to zero, I realized that my machine really loves a low tension. And for every quilt thread I tried after that, a low tension worked best. So that's kind of my findings from my quilt challenge. I have to say, it was a little stressful this week being sick and having family in town that I put this challenge on myself. But I was also glad I did this because it actually made me take the time to figure out things about my machine and to learn new things, research things, and I am really thankful that I did that because I learned a lot and I'm still totally learning. Like in this video right now, I'm talking about that bar that has the batting, and I've watched a few videos since then, and I pinned my batting to that bar this time, and then I didn't like it. I couldn't reach under through the bars if I needed to access anything, and so I saw some other videos of different ways to load quilt tops since this one, and I decided that I would try something else. But I did finish this quilt last night at the 9th hour because I had so much issues with the quilting before, and I gave my machine like a really nice spa day yesterday to try to work everything out, but it was finished and it's my final quilt top. And so I think that I finished 13 quilt tops plus the quilt sandwich, one of the quilt tops being a baby quilt and one of the quilt tops being my mom. It might actually be 14 with my hand quilting. I'm just giving you a closer look at the quilting on this. It's kind of fun. But I am actually going to share a video in a couple days of every quilt. I'll just hold up every quilt that I finished quilting so you can see them all. Half of them aren't trimmed. Well, none of the ones from the last 2 weeks are trimmed, but I'm also going to share all the quilt tops that I had already quilted but still have to bind. So I am in the clear for quilt tops now, except for one quilt top I have left, which is my floored quilt top, and I'll show it at the end here. That is 108 inches by 108 inches, so it's too big for any of my frames, even my last frame. I had made it for my guest bedroom at my old house years ago, never quilted it, and now I think I actually might use it to upholster a chair and make another one to upholster a second matching chair. I haven't quite decided yet, but I hope that some of the information that I shared in these videos was inspiring to you if you have a long arm, helpful to you. I hope that seeing me finish all these quilt tops is inspiring as well because it feels so, so, so good to get all of these quilt tops done And now I'm at ground zero, so to speak, where I can actually just make a quilt and quilt it right away. I don't have a backlog, and it is amazing feeling. So I do actually still have 4 quilts that aren't quilted, but they're all basted and in the process of being hand quilted, or are basted thinking I would quilt them on my domestic. And then I got a long arm. So you know how long that's been. Basted for over almost 5 years at least. So I am not completely, I guess, at ground zero, but I'm pretty darn close. So I just wanted to show my face here because you've been seeing a lot of stuff that I've been doing. And I think it's just been a really great challenge for me, having finished all my quilt tops in the last 2 weeks, because that's all I was doing pretty much. I would not have done that if I wasn't doing this challenge, which I think is why when people host whip challenges or quilting challenges or whatever, it's awesome to join in if you can. It's kind of like extra motivation to get things done. And last night, finishing that Starfy quilt that was the last quilt you saw back there, I was like, kept telling myself, you don't really have to do this. I was so tired. It was a long day, but I was like, had that mindset that I was going to get this, all my quilt tops done, and I did not want to disappoint myself. And after I finished it, which was like right as my kids were going to bed, I was like, yes, I feel so good about getting that done and taking that extra time today. And I didn't think it was going to happen for a little while yesterday because I had some major issues and could not figure things out on my machine, but I took my time. I did some research. I went through it very methodically, and that's one thing I learned from the Leah Day videos is just like, if you're having issues, as painful as it can be sometimes, especially if you're on a deadline, going in small increments step by step is going to really make the biggest difference for you in trying to figure out if something is going wrong or how to fix what's going wrong, I guess. And I think that tip can work towards domestic machines as well, because we all know that we have had issues with like our domestic sewing machine too. So I am thankful that you were hanging out with me, hopefully on Instagram, watching these videos. I hope that you enjoyed it. Like I said, I'll be back later this week with a video of me holding up every single quilt that is quilted currently in my studio, along with I'm sharing the 4 basted quilts that have some level of hand quilting on them. So my next challenge, because I have a lot of quilted quilts now, is going to be binding. And I'm going to test out some different types of binding, but also I'm not rushing that. It's probably going to be like a 2-month challenge because I love to hand stitch my binding. So I'll probably get all of the bindings sewn on with the machine and then have them sitting ready to hand bind as I have time, or I'm going to like a maker's meetup or need to have something that my hands can be doing while I'm like hanging out or something. So yeah, that's my quilt top challenge. It's been a crazy 2 weeks, and I am excited to be on this side of it. So I'll see you around Instagram and YouTube.